Thank you for listening and supporting the Daily Memphian. Sign up for one of our many free newsletters and breaking news alerts at dailymemphian.com/email to receive the latest local news stories impacting our community. Our weekly newsletters cover everything from sports to arts and culture, business, food, and more, along with daily updates of all the news we publish each day. Sign up or manage your email preferences at dailymemphian.com/email.
This is the Daily Memphian Politics Podcast. I'm Bill Dries. The main event is Reverend Earle Fisher on this month's People's Summit and the State of Activism in Memphis. Top of the podcast, Shelby County Assessor of Property Melvin Burgess Jr. opens his re-election campaign starting with the May 2022 Democratic primary. Burgess seeking a second term following a reappraisal year countywide and a controversial proposal approved by the Shelby County Commission to move from once every 4-year reappraisals to a reappraisal every other year, which means a resetting of the local property tax rates every other year. At the Shelby County Election Commission this past week, a renewed push by citizens favoring hand-marked paper ballots, urging the commission to drop its selection of new voting machines with a paper trail. Election Commission Chairman Brent Taylor saying the commission has made its choice and it's up to the county commission to take a vote on it, either approve the purchase of the new voting system or reject it in this off-election year. The Election Commission has already voted, as we said, to file suit against the county commission, but has delayed that as Taylor sought to at least get a county commission vote on the matter. The lawsuit would claim the Election Commission's responsibility is to pick a voting system, while the county commission's role is to fund whatever system the Election Commission picks. Taylor was having trouble finding a commissioner to even sponsor such a resolution on the voting machines. The back and forth at the Election Commission is a reminder that claims of voter fraud cross partisan lines, with the local claims heavy on references to the hackability of the machines, but without the claims that the 2020 presidential election nationally was rigged. Those claims have come to dominate the national discussion. At this point, we're halfway through this off-election year, with county primaries coming next May. That's Election Day. The early voting begins in mid-April. And as we will discuss later, 2022 elections in Shelby County feature the set of judicial offices with 8-year terms of office, making the August county general election ballot the longest of any cycle in Shelby County politics. Big changes in the ranks of Shelby County schools, the latest in a series of changes that include the school system abruptly ending its contract with Porter Leith for Head Start early childhood services. Superintendent Joris Ray rolling out a slate of 24 new principals for the school year that begins in August. A lot of turnover, and Ray telling our Deja Henry that there may be more changes as some in the ranks react by retiring or otherwise leaving. The goal by Ray is to fill all vacant principal positions. In his own administration, Antonio Burt, the former chief academic officer for the district, and before that Ford Road Elementary School principal, now becomes chief of schools. That position created in a restructuring 4 years ago under Ray's predecessor Dorsey Hobson and held by Sharon Griffin, who left for a short tenure at the state's Achievement School District, with the position vacant since her departure. Burt's chief academic officer position goes to Jerron Carson, one of the Instructional Leadership District directors, and before that, principal of Lucy E. Campbell Elementary School. Republican U.S. Senator Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee tweeting this past week, quote, "New rule, police protection should not be offered to any lawmaker that wants to defund the police. They should be forced to practice what they preach." That was followed by a link to Vogue magazine's profile of First Lady Jill Biden, referring to it as, quote, Democrat propaganda. Blackburn turning up in a set of politically themed playing cards based on the 2020 Senate impeachment trial acquittal of President Donald Trump, the first of the 2 Senate impeachment trials of Trump. A company called BananaRepublicCards.com has Blackburn as a 5 of clubs with her, quote, "I will not act as a useful contrarian" included on the card. By comparison, Kentucky Senator Rand Paul is the 9 of hearts, and Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell is the ace of spades, while Texas Republican Ted Cruz is the 3 of hearts. The former president shows up in the deck as a joker. The company bills its deck as, quote, "made for extended shuffling and long-term play." In the House this past week, Memphis Democrat Steve Cohen and Germantown Republican David Kustoff going different ways in the vote on a House panel to investigate the January 6th Capitol insurrection, both present on the House floor during that insurrection, Cohen voting for the panel, Kustoff voting against it. After order was restored in the Capitol that day, Kustoff among those voting to contest the Electoral College votes of Pennsylvania, one of 2 states whose votes some Republicans in the Capitol voted to contest after the insurrection. Same song, second verse the next day on the $715 billion 5-year surface transportation bill, Cohen yes and Kustoff no. Kustoff saying the bill has too much Green New Deal and not enough roads and bridges infrastructure. Cohen says the bill, which was approved, includes funding for 6 new electric buses, all those for the Memphis Area Transit Authority, a redo of the Poplar-Cooper intersection for a long-talked-about bicycle and pedestrian entrance to Overton Park, and a fix for the 6-way Orange Mound intersection of Lamar, Kimball, and Pendleton. And there is funding for the ongoing work on Elvis Presley Boulevard in Whitehaven. Jerry Green, the 2020 Democratic nominee for State House District 83, a challenge of incumbent Republican Mark White that White won in the 2 close races in the Shelby County delegation to Nashville last year, is now a policy advisor to Shelby County Mayor Lee Harris, who's running for what this week a bit different this time, but instructive. Trying to go from one elected office to another usually involves a fair amount of waiting to see what another elected official is going to do. Our guests on WKNO's Behind the Headlines this week are 2 of the 5 term-limited Shelby County commissioners, Democrat Van Turner and Republican Mark Billingsley, and several key topics to be explored there, including whether the county tax season is over or still going. We'll run all of that down in a bit. But we also asked about their respective political plans in 2022 and beyond. First Turner and then Billingsley.
And so it's all about timing and properly placing yourself to have the best opportunity to be successful. And so I think there's more work in preparation than in, you actually saying you're going to run for the position. So I'm doing a lot of the prep work now and seeing what's best for me and talking to my family and friends and making sure I make the right decision. But I'm definitely interested in seeking another office.
All right, Mark?
I think that was an excellent answer and really, really good. Yeah, can I just say ditto? I've been I will, at the end of my term, will have served on the county commission 9 years, and like Commissioner Turner, I'll be term limited out. I have really, really enjoyed public service. It really started as a volunteer in the city of Germantown, volunteering in the city of Memphis, having served as city councilman in Germantown, now county commissioner. I've really enjoyed public service. Some people have hobbies and serve on a million boards. I've really enjoyed the last 9 years as a commissioner. We are blessed to have a lot of influence on helping people, and that's what draws me to public service. So similar to Commissioner Turner, I'm keeping the door open for what that next place is, but I am interested.
Joining us now is Dr. Earle Fisher, pastor of Abyssinian Baptist Church in Whitehaven, founder of Up the Vote 901, and co-organizer of the 2019 People's Convention, the gathering in the city's last election year that built a platform as well as endorsed candidates in the elections of that year. The pandemic delayed plans for a follow-up, although there were some online conversations, but a People's Summit online gathering is planned for this month, July 31st to be exact. Earle, what do you want to come out of this gathering?
Well, first, Bill, thanks for having me on. It's good to be back with you again. And the Memphis People's Summit, I'm glad you brought up what we did in 2019 with the Memphis People's Convention. I think there has been some misinformation or some conflation going on that what we're doing this year is exactly what we did in 2019. And that's not the case this year. And I also need to underscore that it's not just online. This is going to be a hybrid event, which is to say there'll be some in-person gathering, and it'll be some virtual and online. But the purpose of the summit is to first advance the development of the Memphis People's Agenda that we released in 2019, and to point us collectively towards a more direct policy-oriented framework. There are sections in the Memphis People's Agenda, the Memphis City Budget, crime and safety, labor and wages, housing and the environment, and education. And there are people who are passionate about those issues. There are organizations and institutions who are doing good work in those areas. And we need to gather us together so that we can start articulating what some policy-oriented frameworks would look like so that we can collectively advocate for those. The second thing we hope to do on July 31st at 12 p.m. is to inform voters on where elected officials stand on issues that are important to them, including their voting record on crucial votes. And so this is an opportunity for people who are currently in office to engage some of the constituents and respond to them and have some conversation with them about these critical issues. And so we should be able to mark where people stand while they're in office. And I think it was important for us to organize this in an off election year. You know, we have not had many of these years recently without an election. So, you know, as much as people talk about, you know, what organizations and institutions do and don't do around election time, I think this helps us to communicate our commitment to the long obedience in the same direction and not just popping up or engaging people when elections are immediate, but also when they are far on the horizon. The last thing I think we are going to accomplish at the summit is to connect voters to the networks and the organizations and institutions that are doing work in the areas that they're passionate about and help mobilize them for political power.
Does the agenda change or are things reprioritized to move further up or further down on the list, given what has happened since the agenda was first set in 2019?
So we knew at the offset that the agenda articulated some aspirations. And I think you're right that the realities that we engage in daily that are always evolving and subject to change help shape what the priorities are within the agenda, what we accomplished with the agenda. And I've been able to, for lack of better terms, deploy the agenda in several conversations with several organizations and institutions, not just in Memphis and Shelby County, but around the country, is to document through a very open-ended process. We had over 2,200 people who responded to that survey that formulated the agenda. So we were able to say, here is what, according to our survey demographics, here's what 65% of the Black folks in the city want. You know, here's what the people are asking for. Here's what they are passionate about. And we knew then that we would have to follow up on it to make sure that we are aligning what the people's issues are and what is happening in the community with what we wanted to ultimately see manifest. And so I think, the short answer is yes, that we make these adjustments along the way, and the summit is an opportunity for us to build upon that.
So let's go a little bit broader and get into the state of activism in the city, specifically just more than a year after George Floyd. What does activism in Memphis in the middle of 2021 look like, and what should it look like?
Well, I'm not a sole proprietor of activism in Memphis and Shelby County. I could tell you, some of the things that we've been committed to. I don't know if it would be fair for me to somehow describe what activism should look like. And activism has looked like the same thing it has looked like historically, which is to say there are several different iterations of activism. The organization of the Memphis People Summit is a form of activism and advocacy, but so is the demonstrations that still take place. And whether that is people organizing on the front lines on the ground, or whether people are now attending or paying more attention to city council meetings, county commission meetings. There's some activism that is going on at the federal level around voting rights, at the state level around voting rights, and all around the region as we prepare for what 2022 and 2023 is going to look like. As we are having this conversation, the day that you and I are having it, the Supreme Court basically just shrunk even more of the voting rights from the Voting Rights Act of 1965 with their ruling today on what was coming out of Arizona. And so I think activism is always something that is mindful of the inequities and the systemic injustices that are befalling so many people. And when you start talking about the people in Memphis and Shelby County who are often victims of these inequities, these are Black people. And what activism does is continue to raise the consciousness on these issues. So again, the summit is one way to do that. People are doing activism through writing in op-eds and columns. I hosted a conversation yesterday at the Brooks Museum with two photojournalists, Andrea Morales and Malik Martin, who are doing photojournalism, and they describe the way that their photojournalism is a form of truth telling that is consistent with the type of activism and advocacy work that you see people trying to highlight and promote. So I think Memphis has, in a lot of ways, catapulted the activism of local organizers into the spotlight in ways that have been helpful for the conversation. I think there are conversations that are being had now, whether it is about equity, economic equity and justice, whether it's about criminal justice reform, whether it's about board representation, whether all of these things are more part of the public discourse today than they were 4 or 5 years ago. And it's ironic, if I may say, to hear some people who were resistant of and even rejecting many of the tenets of activism and the philosophies associated with it several years ago, now in some instances trying to be champions or even claiming to be champions of these same things. But it's good to see the needle move. I think it's fair to say that it has not moved aggressively. I think Memphis is still, as you all pointed out after the 2019 election, it is still a moderately conservative city. And it just takes time to build the type of infrastructure and base and broad coalition to change that dynamic more rapidly. But I do think anybody who is mildly objective would say the activism and the advocacy work of groups like Up the Vote 901, Coalition of Concerned Citizens, I would say, the official Black Lives Matter Memphis chapter, several other organizations and institutions are doing the type of work that is changing the landscape of Memphis and Shelby County for the better.
And as you said, while activism is often a synonym for protest, activism has many forms. The protest here a year ago, May, in which more than 100 people were arrested across a dozen consecutive days of protest in the streets, turned a corner and linked up with police reform efforts that were already being discussed to some degree on the city council and the county commission. And some of those proposals came from candidates endorsed by the People's Convention in 2019. So my question here is what we saw here an indication that protest becomes different when some of the points made in the streets are able to be pursued by elected officials who feel the same way?
Well, I really want to say, my first impulse is to say that that's a question above my pay grade because I haven't served in political office, nor do I have any aspirations to do such, other than the fact that I consider pastoring to be a public office, right?
Right.
But what I think I could say is, at best, there is always a wedlock between what is happening at the grassroots level and at the grass tops level. There's always a wonderful harmony when things are working at their best. I want to, reemphasize that when things are at their best, there's always a harmonious conversation and complementarity between what people are doing in the streets and what people are doing in the suites. And I think you pointing to what elected officials such as J.B. Smiley, who attended the People's Convention, Michael and Easter Thomas, who attended the People's Convention, Tammy Sawyer, obviously at the county commission level, Mikhail Lowry was there at the People's Convention as well, supporting his dad. I mean, I think when you see people committed to have these conversations and legitimately hear out what people on the ground and at the grassroots level are saying, and take that into the city council chambers or the county commission chambers or the county mayor's office or the city mayor's office or, you know, some of these other elected officials' offices and spaces, I think this is when you see the change happening. You are, to me, referring back to, or at least peeking back into me saying some of what we advocated 4 years ago. Think about the fight for 15 and some of the same elected officials who are in office now who tend to wave a flag or poke out their chest and thumb their nose about implementing $15 an hour for all of the county workers and $15 an hour for all of the city workers. These are some of the same people who were resistant several years ago. And so this is the power of activism at its best, where it demands that the voices of those who have been pushed to the margins, who exist in communities that suffer from rapid disinvestment and defunding, are now being heard, and those views and values are being articulated through some of the public policy. And I think that that is a great thing when it happens this way, hopefully through, you know, the Memphis People Summit, other efforts and initiatives that are happening that are similar. Hopefully we'll see more of that happen. We still see, in my estimation, far too much political opportunism and posturing. We could talk about the ways that conversations about criminal justice reform or police reform or reimagining policing took place over the last year and a half. But we also have to talk about how people in the community were shut out of the process of who became the next police director because we didn't have some of the public forums, or when we did have one after the police director was already selected, it happened under the guise of this strict fencing and filtration process where people didn't feel comfortable even participating because we know about the histories of the surveillance from the Memphis Police Department and the city of Memphis. So I can't say that we are at a place where we need to run victory laps. I can say that we have seen the needle move, and we need to keep advocating as aggressively as possible in this moment of transition that is not specific to Memphis and Shelby County, but we are in a moment of flux and transition, and some would even argue reconstruction or reformation all over the country, and maybe even all over the globe. So what I want to do is continue to put forth the initiatives and the efforts and the ideas and the philosophies and the opportunities for us to have robust conversation about accountability and transparency, especially for the people who are elected to office, appointed to office, and employed to change the conditions. Because too often, Brother Bill, for the last several years, there's more scrutiny given to activists and organizers for efforts that we put together than it is for people who are elected to office and employed. Some of them making six figures and are charged with changing the conditions, but still have not been unable to do so. And I would surmise also have not, or I would contend, also have not been held accountable for any of their inadequate leadership. So
to the point about elected officials who might have one position on something like the fight for $15 an hour as the minimum wage, but who come around to that, or who come around to other issues on let's say the agenda of the People's Summit, that the specific agenda that comes out of that. How do you gauge whether it's worth to continue conversations with someone who may have changed their position on an issue and distinguish that change or make the distinction or the judgment about whether their change on that position but not on others is a matter of opportunism, or whether it's a part of what you call the robust dialogue of these conversations?
So I don't think we should be in the business of gauging people's morality as much as we are in the business of gauging people's manifestations of the things we say we need. I don't really spend a whole lot of time on political motivations or people's evolution, as long as they land in the right spot as far as history is concerned. What I think about, Brother Bill, is when Franklin Delano Roosevelt is having this conversation with A. Philip Randolph several decades ago, about what is needed. And A. Philip Randolph basically sets the agenda and says to the president, we need A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And FDR says to him, you right, now go out there and make me do it. So whether he would have done it out of political opportunism to stay in connection with that particular base, or because he, for lack of a better term, saw the light of day, right? Or was converted and transformed. At the end of the day, if it helps people in communities that suffer from disinvestment and exploitation and disenfranchisement and high rates of poverty and crime, they don't care about your political motivation. They care about your political manifestation. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. If somebody is evolved, I do know this. Most elected officials in this particular climate won't do it just because it's the right thing to do. They do it because they have felt the pressure and the responsibility to articulate and execute the things that the people who are their constituents require and demand. And I think for far too long, there has been a small minority of rich white men and a few token Black folks that have set the stage for what people in office ultimately prioritize. And what we, as Up the Vote 901, are trying to do with the Memphis People's Summit, with the Memphis People's Conventions that'll come in the coming years, what we're trying to do is level the playing field such that the people who don't always have access to the same amount of economic resources by design are also able to have their voices heard and their values lifted up when we start talking about public policy.
Mm-hmm. In the 2018 county election, since 2022 is a county election year, let's talk about 2018, a year before the People's Convention. Democrats swept every countywide office on the ballot and increased the Democratic majority on the county commission from 7 to 8. Do you feel like that Democratic dominance in the election has turned into the kind of change that you and the people you talk to through Up the Vote and the convention process, do you think that dominance has turned into the kind of change you want to see in county government?
What I would say is I think that it has shifted the sail, at least in the direction of what people wanted to see, which is why I could say earlier that there are ideas on the table. There are proposals that have come up both at the county commission level, at some at the state level, even though we know that our state representatives and state senators who represent West Tennessee, especially Memphis and Shelby County, are just severely outnumbered. And there's only so much you can do when you are up against a supermajority. I would say, but the proposals that have come up, some of the ideas and the policies and some of the proclamations that have come up are signals that we could be headed in the right direction. It's just hard to tell. Bill, I think you know this as well as anybody, that the cycle of political seasons can't really be told in 2 years at the local level. Maybe at the federal level, because, within 2 years, you can lose the House majority or something, right? Or you lose the Senate majority or something like that. But at the local level, it's just hard to tell what the long-term ramifications are going to be. And part of what we are trying to do with the Memphis People's Summit, part of what Up the Vote 901 is trying to do with our, political education classes, is to get people in this broader structural mindset that it's actually called inoculation. We have to inoculate people to let them know it took a long time for us to get into some of these conditions. And it won't take one election cycle. We said this when we started Up the Vote 901 in 2017 and announced it at the National Civil Rights Museum for MLK 50 from the main stage in 2018, that, this is going to have to take several cycles. It's not going to be one election. It's not one individual that you get into office and now all of a sudden all of the community's problems are fixed. Like this is structural. This is systemic. These things take time. We are committed to the long haul of it. And so I can't assess exactly how much progress has been made in the last 2 years, or, you know, if this is somehow signaling this dominance, somehow manifesting all of the things that the people in the community want. I think it's just premature to say that. We have to see what the next several election cycles look like. And then when you start looking back over 5 to 10 years, then you can make a more fair assessment. What I think we can assess right now is if the people who are in office are doing a better job of engaging people in the community on issues that are important to them. And I would say yes, and I would say Up the Vote 901 has had something to do with it.
All right. That's where we'll leave it for now. Much more discussion certainly to come. As you mentioned, 2022 is a county election year, and we've been following that and the folks who have opened up their campaigns, and will continue to do that. That's the year of the big ballot, the once every 8-year judicial races on the ballot in 2022, which is what makes the big ballot big. We have been talking with Dr. Earle Fisher of Up the Vote 901 and co-organizer of the People's Summit coming up July 31st, online and in person at the end of this month. Our guest on WKNO's Behind the Headlines this week, Shelby County Commissioners Mark Billingsley and Van Turner on county government's budget season. Is it over, or does it go into July and possibly August? You can also hear the show on our Behind the Headlines podcast, which includes an extended discussion after the television show wrapped. Subscribe to the Daily Memphian at dailymemphian.com. Subscribe to this podcast and our others at Google Play, iTunes, Spotify, and Stitcher. I'm Bill Drees. The Daily Memphian Politics Podcast is produced by Natalie Van Gundy.
In-depth journalism in the Memphis community, the Daily Memphian is of Memphis, not just in Memphis, and seeks to tell the stories of this city. TheDailyMemphian.com. Truth in place.